which was quite expensive because it was sticking out into the room in a very inconvenient way. Well, thank you all very much for joining us this morning. I'm Paul Saunders, the Executive Director of the Center for the National Interest. I think we've got a terrific panel to talk about what may well be President Trump's most consequential bilateral meeting with the head of state so far after entering office. Obviously, meetings with our key allies like Germany and the UK are quite important. But given China's role in the world today, this is also certainly an extremely important one, and we're very pleased to have such an outstanding group. We will have as our first speaker Dr. Nicholas Lardy, the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, formerly Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, and prior to that, the Director of the Henry M. Jackson School at the University of Washington. Really a very prominent expert on the Chinese economy, the author of several important books on that topic. We're very pleased to have him with us. Following Dr. Lardy, Lieutenant General Chip Gregson, to my immediate right, who of course is the Senior Director for China and the Pacific here at the Center. A former Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asian Affairs in the Obama administration, a former commander of the U.S. Marines in the Pacific and also in Japan, among many other distinguished posts. We're very pleased that he's able to be with us this morning. And then finally also my colleague Harry Kazianis, the executive editor of our magazine, The National Interest, recently a new senior fellow for defense studies also at the Center for the National Interest, and someone who has written quite extensively on security issues in the East Asian region. Since we have three speakers, I've asked each to speak for not more than 7 or 8 minutes so we can preserve ample time for discussion and for questions. We are, of course, on the record. And Dr. Lardy, please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Let me start with, some of my expectations for the trip. I think that they're unlikely to be very detailed or nuanced on the trade and investment front. I think that's going to be a secondary topic after Korea, which I'm sure the other speakers are going to cover in great detail, so I won't say anything about it. I think there are several reasons for this besides the importance of Korea. I think U.S. trade policy is not yet in place. It's still being hotly debated internally. And my view is that the nativistic protectionist forces in the White House are likely to lose policy influence over time. I think they already have, to more globally oriented advisors. And I think the executive orders that were issued last Friday tend to confirm that conclusion, that it's they're kind of a sop to this nativistic approach, but I don't think they're going to amount to anything. Certainly, we're not going to impose a unilateral tariff on China. I think China is not going to be named a currency manipulator. Some people think that the president doesn't want to backpedal on these issues, but he's backpedaled on NAFTA, and I think he's going to do the same on trade with China. Now, what are the possible positives? She could reconfirm, restate some of the market opening measures that China has announced over the past couple of months, maybe enhance them slightly. They haven't gotten very much attention in the West, but there have been a few modest, I should say, steps that have been taken. He could reconfirm that the China 2025 initiative will not discriminate discriminate against foreign firms. Various Chinese authorities have stated this. I don't think it has come directly from Xi before, so that could be an encouragement for U.S. firms. Maybe there'd be some baby step forward on tightening the sanctions on North Korea, but my view is that a fundamental change in Chinese policy there is it's a very low probability. What's not likely to eventuate, I don't think China is going to come forth with a pared down negative list for the bilateral investment treaty. I don't think that's going to be discussed. There is still a debate in the White House, according to some sources, that about whether or not they should even keep this on the table or whether they ought to do to it what they did to the TPP. And I think furthermore, the president tends to see outbound investment as an export of jobs, and so I think he's not very enthusiastic about bilateral investment treaties that are designed to improve the access of U.S. firms for investing in foreign markets. So I'm not expecting that. Let me just say a few things on the broader perspective of the relationship. I guess I'm coming down to the view that I don't think a great deal is going to change in the bilateral economic and investment relationship, despite all the rhetoric of the campaign. I don't think CFIUS is likely to be dramatically expanded. It could be tweaked around the edges, but I don't think it's going to be significantly tougher than it had, based on a new set of criteria, as some people have argued. I think China is going to continue to open up its market to foreign investment, even on a unilateral basis, slowly. I think its currency over time is likely to take on an expanded role in international trade and financial transactions, including the holding of RMB-denominated financial assets in the reserves of many governments. It's going to move very, very slowly. It's only about 85 billion right now, but I think it will expand over time. I think the tightening of capital controls that we have seen, which some people see as a setback, it's tightening of controls and more strict enforcement of existing regulations. I think that will ebb and eventually reverse, and because I think the expectation of a big depreciation of the currency is diminishing substantially. Pressure on the currency is less than it was a few quarters ago. I think as markets gain confidence that the People's Bank can manage the transition to a more market-oriented exchange rate, we're likely to see more liberalization on that front. I think the Trump administration is likely to make greater use of trade enforcement actions against China, which is basically extending a policy that began in the Obama administration, which had more trade enforcement actions per year than any previous administration. This may be helpful for some U.S. industries and firms, but I think it's unlikely to bend the curve in terms of the large and still growing trade deficit with China. Those actions haven't, as I say, they could be important on the micro level, but they're not likely to be significant on the macro level. And I'd say finally in this broad picture, just to wind up, I think it's likely that the U.S. global trade deficit will rise under Trump, despite all of his talk about reducing deficits. I think if we have an unfunded tax cut, which seems increasingly likely, that the Fed will raise interest rates more than is now anticipated. The rise in U.S. interest rates will cause the dollar to appreciate. Other things being equal, that's going to mean more imports and fewer exports and a bigger global trade deficit. So I think he's worked himself into a very, very difficult position with this fundamental contradiction between what he'd like to do on the trade side and what he'd like to do on the tax side. And there's a fundamental misunderstanding in significant parts of the White House about how the trade relationship will work. You can't go after the U.S. deficit by pinging on country-by-country basis on bilateral deficits. It's not going to produce the desired outcome. So that.
Thank you very much. Chip Gregson.
Thank you. I was asked to speak about security considerations that could be on the table at Mar-a-Lago, and I'll address two of them, Korea and Japan. But first, I'd like to sketch for discussion a little bit of context on the U.S. China relationship. It opened under Nixon, for whom we used to be named here. His goal was to balance against the Soviet Union, also to create cover for our withdrawal from Vietnam. And in effect, it did end U.S. isolation from China and, by extension, ended China's isolation elsewhere. Managing tensions has seemed to be the goal since then, and it's a bipartisan thing. Bush 41 kept personal contact with Deng Xiaoping after Tiananmen. Clinton was known as the globalization president, and we started talking about economic success likely to lead to political liberalization. Bush 43's characterization was candid, constructive, and cooperative in a relationship. And President Obama was seeking common ground and to manage differences. President Trump, to my knowledge, we have yet to articulate a nice, snappy phrase for what the relationship might be, and whether this is too big a relationship to fail. The essential question before we get into what the specifics might be with Japan and Korea is, what do we want out of the relationship? And I'd call your attention to a popular column in the Washington Post, Carolyn Hack's. It's in your style section every day, where she's the local agony aunt and does an awful lot of relationship counseling. And one can take a lot of the peccadillos in our relationship with China over the past two administrations and substitute them for the specific problems Carolyn is talking about. And we probably come up with some of the same conclusions in Carolyn's column, particularly candor. A partial list of things that have been at the very least irritating in the U.S. China relationship. 2007, their anti-satellite test, creating a massive debris cloud that endangers the International Space Station and U.S. intelligence satellites. 2009, the U.S. naval ship Impeccable harassment. 2011, a stealth fighter rollout during the visit of Secretary of Defense Gates to Beijing. This is significant as sort of an in-your-face, because Secretary Gates had written before that China was not that far along on stealth weapon development. It was also a precursor. Secretary Panetta the next year visited Beijing. Another stealth aircraft was rolled out. The next year, Secretary Hagel visited Beijing. Another stealth aircraft was rolled out to overshadow the visit. 2012, the Scarborough Shoal incident. 2013, the Air Defense Identification Zone announcement by China over the East China Sea after Vice President Biden had already announced his impending trip to Beijing via Tokyo. ADIZs are traditionally used to manage tensions. This one seemed to work the other way, because China attached very strict rules to the ADIZ, at least rhetorically, and promised that any airplane violating these procedures would be met with, quote, emergency defensive measures, unquote, which sounds remarkably like a threat. 2014, after we invited China to participate in the Rim of the Pacific exercise, they came to participate and also brought their own spy ship to collect communications. 2015, the famous island building in the South China Sea. Also, that was the year of the Office of Management and Budget hack. 2016, Sunnyland Summit, where President Xi, we're told, promised President Obama he would not militarize the features in the South China Sea. And last incident, maybe not the last, but the last one that spikes in my memory, is the G20, where President Obama landed at Beijing International Airport in Air Force One, which, as you all know, is a 747, and suddenly in all of Beijing International Airport, the Chinese could not find a ramp to allow the president to exit Air Force One from the normal ceremonial door. A lot of these incidents can be dismissed as insignificant by themselves, but I'd like to point out that nobody is more concerned with and more attentive to the signals and the image of protocol. The Chinese virtually invented official protocol. And this is, in one extension, a process of psychological warfare to diminish the image of the United States in the eyes of at least their own people. And it's something that We have heretofore not objected much to any of these individual incidents. So, my recommendation for what our relationship ought to be is concentrating on the bigger picture, and it's all about alliances and friends, not necessarily about individual events. We have to have a vector on where we're going. Secondly, echoing perhaps Carolyn Hack's, we need to restore candor to the relationship. It's okay to have two conversations going on with another party at the same time. Businesses do it all the time, competing in one area with Company X and cooperating in other areas with Company X. We need to have as many positive conversations with China as we can possibly generate, if for nothing else than to create the context for the times when we must have a harder conversation. Some things are best said and kept in private. Other things need to be said publicly for our own needs of alliance maintenance, alliance enhancement, alliance reinforcement, and some public statements also additionally serve the purpose of striking a chord that tends to make China uncomfortable. It apparently is okay for China to create domestic unrest in the United States, but it is definitely not okay, according to China, for us to contribute to domestic unrest in China. This is an imbalance. We need to come to a better equilibrium. Now, on specifics on Korea, the North Korean threat is no longer business as usual. We have been trying, at least in my period of being cognizant of what we were doing from about 1992, to restrain North Korea's nuclear and missile development programs, and in that we have been singularly unsuccessful. We've ramped up sanctions, or said we're ramping up sanctions after pretty much every incident. Sanctions may work at some point. I think we can agree they certainly haven't yet. The North Korean leadership sits atop a worldwide global mafia, and money flows in channels that are at least difficult to get to, even if we know about them. The summary is that they are bad, they're bold, and they're going to achieve nuclear capability. We need to take them at their word on this. It's interesting that they managed to launch a missile just last night ahead of the Mar-a-Lago meeting. I would also call attention to the fact that they developed, deployed, and employed VX, a particularly nasty, matter of fact, the nastiest nerve gas in any of these inventories. A little drop will do you to kill many, many people. How it worked that they managed to kill the older Kim brother without killing a number of people at Kuala Lumpur airport is beyond me. But the fact of the matter is, North Korea felt no restrictions against deploying a very, very nasty nerve gas in another country for their own thing. China should be told that if they cannot or if they will not help us to restrain North Korea, then we have no other alternative but to reinforce our alliance capabilities. And this time we need to do it. We said that in 2009, and not much happened. But now that North Korea is right on the verge of nuclear weapons capability, we need to reinforce alliance capabilities in a manner that is suitable to reestablishing deterrence, perhaps even adopting the Cold War posture with the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, airborne 24 hours a day, reintroducing nuclear weapons to the region. All these things should be on the table, and all these things should be discussed in the context of reinforcing our alliance capabilities and our alliance obligations. In Japan, you know the situation, the maritime militia and armed fishing boats still pressing on Japanese territory. The Chinese embargoed rare earth exports at one point not too long in the past. Aerial intrusions into Japanese airspace are at high Cold War levels. During the Cold War, it was Russian intrusions. Now it's Chinese intrusions, and this is a significant cost-imposing measure on Japan. They just doubled the amount of F-15 squadrons stationed at Naha Air Base in Okinawa to respond more readily to the Senkakus. Japan, the good news is they're enhancing their capabilities rapidly. They've adopted a joint dynamic defense doctrine, and they're rapidly improving their ability to be interoperable or even integrated with U.S. forces in the event of a conflict. Recommendations: many more bilateral exercises and abundant demonstration that we're in this together with Japan. And something that Nick did not mention, tremendous self-inflicted wound on the collapse of the TPP effort. We need some deal with some deal with Japan very quickly to reinforce the trade relationship, to enhance and maintain and improve our relationship with Japan. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Harry.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks for coming out so early this morning. I'm going to cover two things. I'm going to cover what Robert Kaplan calls Asia's cauldron, or the South China Sea, and then I'm going to move over into Taiwan. So I think if we look at China's actions over the last several years, one thing is pretty clear. Beijing wants to dominate the South China Sea, and basically turning it into what James Holmes calls a Lake Beijing, that it basically has soft control over. And I don't think really we should be shocked. This is what great powers have done really throughout history. They seek to dominate the near seas around them as they get more powerful. Beijing is doing the same thing in the East China Sea, as Chip mentioned, and around Taiwan. Also, I think we have to keep in mind, China's a $10 trillion economy now. This isn't the sick man of Asia anymore. This isn't the China of the 1970s. They're going to want more say in the international space around them, and that's for obvious reasons. But the way I think they're going about it, with very aggressive and coercive tactics, it's highly destabilizing. It's essentially creating a mini arms race. This really puts China in a dangerous collision with all of its neighbors. The ones that have competing claims in the South China Sea, as well as the United States and India, which also utilizes the South China Sea, really anybody who does. So why should Americans care? And why, for this matter, why should Donald Trump care? Well, there's $5 trillion in seaboard trade that passes through the South China Sea. $1.2 trillion is U.S. seaborne trade. So that means jobs. Also, much of the natural resources that power the economies of Asia must pass through the South China Sea in some way. So, for example, Japan gets 60% of its natural resources from seaborne trade that comes through the South China Sea. So think about this for a second. Imagine a crisis over, say, the Senkaku Islands. If China were to try and cut off seaborne trade in the South China Sea, which I think in the next couple of years they would have the capabilities to do, that would basically create an existential crisis, one of which I think Tokyo would try to draw Washington into. So how is China working to dominate the South China Sea? Well, we talk a lot about fake news. Well, China's creating fake islands, but these islands are very real. Many have runways that a lot of their large bombers can be based on. They're building up ports that their aircraft carriers, soon to be 3 aircraft carriers, could probably deploy to, where their submarines can go to. They're building point defense systems. They're putting air defense systems similar to the S-300 and others. So they're building up their capabilities very quickly. Now, these bases aren't massive, huge bases, but they do have the capabilities to change the status quo, and I think that's what a lot of people are worried about these days. And it gives China the capability, like I said, to create sort of a soft control over the South China Sea. In fact, I don't think it's out of the question in the months and years to come, China could declare an air defense identification zone just as they did in the East China Sea. Now, if we look at just how big the South China Sea is, I think even the next couple of years it would be very difficult for China to really have full control over the South China Sea in the air. But they would be able to use an air identification zone in ways to sort of pin and prick when there's different crises. So let's say there's a crisis over the Senkaku Islands or over Taiwan. They could sort of selectively enforce that zone, and that creates problems. So sort of getting to the summit, is there any possibility of compromise over the South China Sea in the summit? No way. The U.S. and China have very different visions of how nations utilize the near seas. America believes in freedom of navigation, even military vessels sort of traversing through the 200-mile EEZ. China does not. I think we have to remember something very important. China thinks of the South China Sea as a body of water that's an extension of its own territory. In the past, Beijing has drawn what's called a 9, or sometimes referred to as a 10-dash line around the South China Sea, which basically goes from Taiwan all the way down to Malaysia. China's doing something I think that's very unique that I think we have to understand. It really hasn't been done in centuries. they're drawing basically international lines through the oceans. And I think that's really something that we have to understand and really take into account in our thinking. The Philippines it challenged China's 9 and 10 line claims, and they largely won that. But that doesn't really stop them from pressing their claims. So what is the Trump administration going to do about this? Well, I think at the moment we've had a lot of sort of competing things that have been said. There's been a lot of talk about what Rex Tillerson said in his confirmation hearings, where he sort of made these strange sort of references that it almost sounded like a blockade, or we would stop them from utilizing their bases. I think he actually misspoke. I don't think that's what he meant. But I think for right now, we don't really know what the policy is going to be. It's, at least in my estimation, that the administration is probably going through a policy review. They're weighing their options, trying to see what the best approach is. Keep in mind, they haven't conducted any freedom of navigation operations or FONOPs. So I think that's important. So I think for the time being, I think we can say the South China Sea is really a big foreign policy question mark for the administration. Now, to Taiwan. I think China's goal here is pretty clear, and they've been pretty clear about this. I think it's the eventual reunification of Beijing and Taipei. At least until the last few years, relations between China and Taiwan have been getting much better. Trade between both sides was booming. Tourism was flourishing. There's even been direct flights. President Ma and Xi Jinping actually met before President Ma's term was over, and that was very historic. Actually, back in 2015, I was in Taiwan for National Day as a guest of the Taiwanese government, and I have to tell you that there was a lot of mainland tourists there. They were absorbing a lot of the different things that were going on in Taiwan. They were watching Taiwanese TV. They were absorbing sort of the media debates and the debates over the presidential election, and there was very strong interaction. There was a lot of hope. But at the same time, a lot of people in the Taiwanese government were saying in public comments to us and to our group that they were really afraid of the future. And I think with the rise of the Sunflower Movement in 2014 and the loss of the KMT, bringing in a new president, relations have become more confrontational. I think that was natural. Actually, experts I've spoken to in the last couple days, as well as a good friend who's a retired senior official in the PLA, are really afraid what the Trump administration might do. Maybe not outright, encouraging independence, but what my friend in the PLA said is independence without a declaration. So things like, for example, a massive arms deal. There's been talk about maybe selling THAAD to Taiwan, maybe selling F-35s, much higher level contacts, possibly a free trade agreement. So basically giving Taiwan a tremendous amount of international space. So why should Americans care about this, and why should Trump care? I think the biggest reason is actually pretty simple. China's massive military buildup really over the last 20 years has been over a Taiwan contingency. If Taiwan were to declare independence or something like that. Also, what Beijing is very afraid of is a repeat of the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, where you have American aircraft carrier battle groups basically moving into the region to deter China from any actions. They don't want that repeated. So this is why we talk a lot about carrier killer missiles and things of that nature, because basically they want to deter the United States. So what is going to happen at the summit over Taiwan? Well, I think obviously now with the recent North Korean missile test, I think North Korea is going to basically dominate the headlines. And I think also trade is going to probably be the other thing they're going to talk about. And they only have 2 days, so we have to keep in mind there's going to be a lot of trying to posture to get to one another. So I don't know how much Taiwan is going to come up, at least in sort of the public discussions we're going to hear about. But I would look for Trump to make a statement like he has done already, basically reaffirming the U.S. One China policy. And keep in mind, I said the U.S. One China policy. That's very different than what Beijing believes that is. So just quickly, what will Trump do in the future over Taiwan? I think it's pretty clear that there's going to be some sort of arms deal. There's been talk in Japanese press about, like I said, F-35s or THAAD. Just quickly, I think F-35s are a mistake. They're too expensive. Taiwan doesn't have the budgets to buy a lot of them. As for THAAD, I think in theory it sounds like a good idea, but in practice we have to keep in mind China has 1,500 short and medium range missiles. They're sitting across the Taiwan Strait. THAAD or even multiple THAAD batteries would get overwhelmed. I think the best thing the Trump administration can do, if it's trying to reinforce the status quo, is really do what a professor at the Naval War College said a few years ago, which is basically to turn Taiwan into a giant porcupine, make it very difficult for Beijing to try and interfere or invade the island. Essentially, like I said, reinforce the status quo. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Let's open it up to questions, and if I could please ask each of you to identify yourselves before asking a question, and we should have someone with a mic. But please, over here.
I'll just shout.
Yeah.
Edward Luce from the Financial Times. Ed Luce from the Financial Times. Thanks for those three very, very helpful presentations. Could you speak a little bit about how the personalities of Trump and Xi Jinping might interact? I mean, the list general that you gave of Chinese actions over the last few years took place in the context of far more predictable U.S. presidents. Is the fact that we've got a much, much less predictable man in the White House, in Mar-a-Lago, going to change China's behavior and the way it tests America's limits?
I think you did a column on that question, didn't you? Wow. Well, I think your point about unpredictability is well taken, and I'm not the one that's going to be able to predict with any certainty how this is going to last. But one thing to consider might be that neither leader is sitting in a terribly rock-solid, secure position. So there may be some accommodation reached so that each looks very good coming out of this, as opposed to something that has more of a win-lose or that has a humiliation attached to it. I'm of the school that thinks that the amount of unrest that occurs frequently across China and the amount of money that's moving out of China and other things indicate that the leadership crown sits a little bit uneasily now, and this contributes to Chinese sensitivity regarding territorial claims and things. It used to be communism, nationalism, and the economy were things that sustained the leadership. Now it's the fact that the economy is allegedly booming or was booming, plus the redemption for the century of humiliation. Harry mentioned China's unlikely to compromise in the South China Sea. I think it's absolutely impossible after Xi Jinping himself has adopted this mantra of undisputed historical sovereignty. Neither Xi nor any of his cohorts can afford to be seen to be stepping back from that, nor can they be seen especially to be cooperating with the hegemonic power on anything. So this is going to be a delicate balance for the two of them to strike, so that each leader can come away with this with a plausible story that it was a worthwhile dialogue.
Part of your question was how is this changing Xi? I think the big change is Xi's willing to take a substantial risk in coming to this summit and dealing with an unpredictable, unscriptable president. This could go very badly for him, and I think the fact that he's willing to take that risk does suggest some change in their approach.
That's a good point.
Just quickly, Ed, I think it's a great question. Let me answer it a little bit different way than some of my colleagues. I think we have to keep in mind actually Xi Jinping and Trump have one similarity. I think that's very important. They both want to make their countries great again. If you look at what Xi said in the past when he took over the presidency, he came up with this great idea of the Chinese dream, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, righting historical wrongs. That isn't very different what Trump's been saying and wanting to make America great again. And I think there's two ways it could go. It could create a very adversarial relationship where they look at each other and say, this is a zero-sum game. If I win here, China loses there and vice versa. So that makes it very dangerous. But at the same time, there could be areas of opportunity where both sides come together on different things. Now, there is a lot of different tensions. I mean, like I said, we have the South China Sea, we have Taiwan, we have the East China Sea, we have North Korea, and now we have trade. But I do think we have to keep in mind that this is a time where, in the next couple of months, China is going to go through a little bit of a leadership transition. So with that sort of in play, I don't think the Chinese are going to want to make tremendous waves. I think they're going to want to sort of consolidate the things they've done in the South China Sea. They're not going to want to see any waves being made by North Korea. And I think probably for the next couple months, we're going to see some stability. Whether that holds, different question.
The gentleman here, and then Bud McFarland.
Thanks. Bob Davis with the Wall Street Journal. I had a question for you just generally. Why, I mean, Xi is the one pushing for this meeting. Why do you think he is? What do you think he gets out of it? And also, to General Gregson, when you talked about reestablishing alliance capabilities, what does that specifically mean? And specific to Nick as well, talking about the trade disputes and so on, would it make sense for the U.S. to drop its strong dollar policy? Some of your colleagues have talked, I think they use the term appropriate dollar, to get at this question of, in a more reasonable way, to get at this question of currency manipulation.
Let me start with the what we mean about strengthening alliance capabilities. THAAD, the Theater High Altitude Area Defense System, is much in the news. It's interesting that China apparently very much fears THAAD more than they fear nuclear weapons in the hand of Kim Jong-un. I think we need to press more on the idea of defense against a nuclear North Korea with both of our Northeast Asian allies. The Japanese, incidentally, are talking about acquiring an independent strike capability to be employed in an alliance context. We're not quite sure what that is. They're not quite sure what it is yet. But I think the signal here to the United States is that it's getting increasingly difficult for Japan to outsource their deterrence against a nuclear attack to the United States, that Japan's going to want, at least for political purposes, some way to counter an imminent attack. There's all sorts of reasons why logically this becomes very difficult, but politically I think that the need is compelling there. Secondly, on the reinforcing alliance capabilities, I mentioned Japan's very credible effort since about 2011 to normalize their defense establishment. I think this is continuing. I think we need to continue to encourage it, and I think there's value in demonstrations with exercises and things to show that we're getting stronger together than we've been before. So it's not just collective defense as a label. It would be collective, or what we might call combined defense operations and support. The Philippines, interesting treaty ally lately. America enjoys, I think the last poll I saw was a 92% approval rating among the Filipinos, but President Duterte enjoys a high approval rating too. So not much we can do to, or should do, to affect the political situation in the Philippines. The Philippines will sort it out. But meanwhile, we need to work with our other allies and things to get the Philippines better capability in the things that matter to the Philippines. While we can fly, sail, and operate anywhere in the South China Sea that we want to, carrier battle groups do not do a lot for Philippine fishermen who are being pressed and harassed by the Chinese maritime militia and the Chinese fishing fleets. The Philippines needs much better awareness of what's happening in the South China Sea. There is technology available to enhance that. The Philippines also needs ways to enforce their own fishing areas, which means patrol boats, which means other aspects. And we need to help the Philippines, as do our other more capable allies in the Pacific there, not in the sense of and I'm certainly not arguing for things that would provoke a conflict, but I'm arguing for things that can contribute to deterrence and contribute to decreasing tensions. If the Philippines, or for that matter Vietnam, lose access to their fishing areas, where do they get protein for their population? Vietnam especially, it's not known for any other coastline except the one that's on the South China Sea. Those types of things, I think, are where we need to go on in enhancing what we're enhancing our alliance capabilities.
Why do you think she's
I was hoping Nick or Harry was going to jump on that one. So.
Well,
Dick, did you want to?
Well, I just subscribe to the conventional wisdom on this, and that is she wants to have a stable relationship with the United States running up to the Party Congress. He wants a stable domestic economy. He wants stable foreign policy, particularly with the United States. He certainly does not want a trade war. Even though China, I think, would come out losing less than the U.S. would, they don't want to incur those kinds of costs. So I think that's the basic motivation. On the currency question, I don't think. The key policy is to have the dollar determined by market forces, which is where we've been for decades. And whether you call that a strong dollar policy or an appropriate dollar, I think is more a question of a bumper sticker rather than substance.
all right, Mr. McFarland, and then Mr. Keith.
Russia is not on the agenda this morning, but I'd be interested if the panelists, which have been superb, could comment on the current ability of Russia, having established a position, a prevailing influence in Syria, and one can argue by dint of their arms sales, nuclear power generation for Iran, in a position, if they had better financial resources, Russia that is, to run the table from Syria to Iraq and Iran. And China, on the other hand, is very vulnerable energy-wise. They are at once building, 25 million automobiles a year and still reliant on foreign sources for transportation fuel. How do you see the relationship right now? They've had a number of very significant energy deals, China and Russia. Is the relationship a stable one? Finally, do you think that a kind of obvious opportunity for cooperation with the United States, which is to import fuel from the United States, and I'm not talking about LNG, although that's certainly on the table. The best vehicle fuel in the world, as the Chinese have proven, is methanol, made from natural gas. With the price of gas in our country where it is, methanol is an obvious solution. Chinese have always had reservations about their vulnerability to foreign sources of transportation fuel. Could you comment on this kind of family of pretty much ignored both risks and opportunities for China?
Who'd like to go first? No? General.
I'm not currently. I'm not considered any kind of expert on the Middle East, despite numerous trips there. But Russian assertiveness has certainly been opportunistic, and wherever the U.S. and our friends have created a vacuum, they've managed to move pretty smartly into it. The next issue may be Belarus, which neatly would flank the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which would invite all sorts of difficulties on NATO obligations and things. I think we're in a position where this is yet another thing that we need to do something about. But I can't. I'm not the one to comment on what. Person to my left is more of an expert on Russia than I am, if I can put the moderator on the spot. On the Chinese-Russian relationship, it's one of I think opportunism and suspicion, I don't think there's any great degree of trust there. Long range, strategically, Russia has a problem with declining population, particularly in the far east of their country, and China has room to expand both officially and unofficially into spaces that are titularly Russian, and reports indicate that there are people that have made the illegal migration there and are working up north. So where this goes, I'm not sure, but it'd be worthy of study.
Go ahead. I have an observation.
Go ahead.
You go first.
Have
No,
your-
you
sure?
go first.
You sure? Okay. Let me take it from the defense side, because that's kind of where the angle I would take. I think if you look at sort of the Russian-Chinese relationship probably over the last 20 years, and you look at what the Chinese have done militarily, so much of the Chinese buildup and some of the advances they've made in their military come from Russia. If you think about air defense, you think about where the HQ-9 came from. It's basically the Russian S-300 that they purchased. Now they're going to buy the S-400. If you look at Chinese aerospace advances in the areas of fighters, the Russian Su-27 that the Chinese bought when Russian defense industry was on its hands and knees looking for any orders, they bought 24 of them and then basically remanufactured some of them in China and then basically started copying them. They're going to buy the Su-35. So I think to what everybody else's point is, it is a relationship of two sides that need each other for a lot of different ways. But I think the danger here, and this is something Dimitri's actually pointed out in quite a few articles, is that if the United States pushes really too far and really tries to contain China, the danger is the Chinese are going to go right to the Russians, and they're going to ally even closer. The Russians at the moment are holding back on some of their even more advanced arms, S-500 that's going to eventually come out, PAC-FA stealth fighter, some of these other super advanced weapons. You could see relationships develop there. So I think we have to sort of be careful on how far we push, but at the same time, I think we have to be realistic and try to reinforce the status quo. That's a very hard balancing act to sort of do, but I think that's where we are.
I'm just going to say two sentences. The first sentence is, I agree with Chip that there is a lot of...
You agree that you're the expert?
No, that,
We all agree.
that there's significant mistrust between Russia and China. The second sentence is that I doubt that Stalin particularly trusted Hitler in 1939. I would think a little bit about that. We have 8 people on my list to ask questions. We have 30 minutes. I want to be fair both to each person who wants to ask a question or make a comment, and also to all of our panelists. What I would like to do is to take the questions 2 at a time, starting with James Keith and Jacob Heilbrunn. Let's have Mr. Keith first. Sorry, Luke down there.
Thank you. I'm Jim Keith. I'm a retired diplomat and currently with the business consulting firm McLarty Associates. It's striking, I think, particularly given the conventional wisdom that our election was a change election, that if this is a fair characterization, all 3 presentations emphasize the status quo. In fact, Harry, you just said reinforce the status quo. And Chip, what you seem to describe, the administration hasn't articulated a policy toward East Asia on security yet, but it seems to be defaulting to hub and spoke. And it seems to me most of what you said would be a reinforcement of that approach. It seems to me the 3 presentations all come together on North Korea, which is an agent of change and an agent that we recognize is forcing the pace of change. How does reinforcing the status quo get us where we need to get to, particularly given, Nick, I agree with you that China is very unlikely to sign on to the kind of severe sanctions regime that would force North Korea back to the table. So how does status quo solve our problems?
And Jacob Heilbrunn.
Thanks. Chip, you began by saying that you would talk about the security discussions at Mar-a-Lago. I thought you were going to talk about security at Mar-a-Lago. My question follows up, is the same. I'll put it more pointed than my previous questioner did. Trump came in as a change agent. Is he really going to wimp out on North Korea, can he allow, after what he said in the past months, North Korea to have the nuclear capability to hit the United States?
All right.
Another typically vague question from Jacob. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, Jim, but I think hub and spoke is a reality. The extremes of the spokes are coming together in many ways. We need to keep encouraging that, but especially now, we need to operate with the alliance system we have instead of trying to change something all of a sudden. North Korea is an agent of change, and will Trump wimp out? North Korea has been famously titled by Victor Cha as the land of lousy options, and this is certainly true. And they've gone from liquid-fueled rockets to solid-fueled rockets. They got mobile launchers from China, by the way. So they are now, even more than they used to be before, a hard target. Will Trump wimp out and allow it? Well, what's the price of elimination of North Korea's nuclear capability, and what's the effect on our allies? Not one of, in my opinion, not one of our allies or friends wants us to start a fight with North Korea because they would take a vast majority of the damage. But they do want us to be there to help look after their interest. And the path out of this that I can see is being able to create an effective deterrent in Northeast Asia and all of Asia for that matter. An effective deterrence is built on an undoubted ability to prevail. And we need to be able to take those actions as necessary to reassure our allies, particularly the two that are closest to the situation, Japan and Korea, that our extended deterrence really is real, and that we're committed to it. Fanciful arguments about precision strikes on North Korea, et cetera, et cetera. There's a reason that North Korea has bought more mining equipment than any other country in the world, and that's the fact that the country is made of granite and other hard minerals. You can do precision strikes, but at some point you're going to have to own the terrain, and that gets into something that has got to be considered on the whole what next question after you do something big and bold to get rid of it. If North Korea, in my opinion, if North Korea is determined to achieve a nuclear capability, they're going to achieve it, and we need to make sure that we react accordingly, not just with our allies, but with our own country, which is why I say we have to start reconsidering a lot of the things that we had in the Cold War posture before we experienced an attack on Hawaii or the Aleutian Islands or Alaska or even the mainland of the United States in some deranged lash out from North Korea.
Nick or Harry?
I'm gonna take your bait, Jacob, and talk a little bit about North Korea for a second. I think Chip's spot on. Basically, three quick things. First, Donald Trump's not going to attack North Korea. I know he's made sort of insinuations. There is a classic State Department, I don't know what you'd want to call it, statement or whatever that came out last night saying we're not going to talk anymore about North Korea or something like that. Look, if you attack North Korea or you tried to take out the North Korean nuclear deterrent, I mean, let's just throw it on the table. Let's say North Korea has 10 nuclear weapons and you only get 8 of them. What are the North Koreans going to do? They're going to most likely use them. It's a use them or lose them type of scenario. So I don't think Donald Trump is going to do anything like that. I think what he is going to do, and this has been circulated in the press, is something that's been talked about called secondary sanctions. In other words, targeting basically any entity, financial institution, company, individual, whatever, that's aiding and abetting North Korea from getting better nuclear weapons and the missiles that would carry them to the United States. I think that's the only way that you can try to mitigate the problem. You're not going to solve the problem, but you can certainly try to slow them down. So I think that's important. The other thing I'm going to throw on the table, and it breaks my heart to say it, but I think you have to try and talk to the North Koreans. That that is not a comforting thing. I don't want to say that. I mean, this is a vile and nasty regime. They have gulags. According to one defector that went to South Korea, he explained to me they have one that's actually the size of Washington, D.C. These are not nice guys you want to talk to, but international politics is not a nice business. So I think it's something that we're going to have to consider. And even if there isn't any breakthrough negotiations with the North Koreans, this is a regime that's cheated on many international deals in the past. I think it's at least important to have some sort of mechanism to talk with them. So if there is a crisis, I mean, let's throw it on the table. What if a North Korean errant missile accidentally landed in Seoul and killed a lot of people? I don't think anybody wants to see a second Korean War and everything that would happen. So I think it is important to have some sort of communication with them. As horrible as that sounds, it is a reality.
All right. Let's go to the next two. We have Stapleton Roy and then the gentleman down here in the blue tie. Ambassador Roy.
Thank you very much for having this session. I think we owe a debt of gratitude to both President Trump and President Xi. It's an action-forcing event because this is exactly what we need to be talking about, it seems to me, at the beginning of a new administration. Your presentations got us off to a very good start, but there are two elements that are missing in our discussion. One is the fact that this administration is unprecedentedly unstaffed to be going into a summit with our major strategic rival in the world. And that has to influence the question of what we want to come out of the summit, because I think it would be disastrous. Every issue mentioned here, the North Korean issue, air defense identification zones, the Taiwan issue, the One China policy, the South China Sea, are very complex issues with long historical backgrounds behind them, and who in the administration at the present time has a grasp of all of these things. You don't want fundamental policies being established at this particular moment in the administration. I can't, Bud, maybe you can comment on this, but I don't recall any administration that has been so backward in terms of getting senior officials into the State Department, the Defense Department, et cetera, at this stage. Ambassadors have dragged behind. I know in the Reagan first term, ambassadors took a long time to get appointed, but not the assistant secretaries and undersecretaries and deputy secretaries. These people move fast, and we haven't moved on that. The second point is we have a Korean crisis in the South. We have new presidential elections coming up in May. We can't discuss North Korea without having some sense of what's the posture of our ally in South Korea going to be, and we don't know that. And that's something that has to come into it. It would seem to me, and I'm making a comment to elicit comments, that in essence you want two things to come out of this summit. You want President Trump and President Xi to either conclude that they can work with each other in a constructive fashion, or they will leave the summit and feel they can't work together. That has enormous implications. And clearly it would be better if they thought that they could work together. The second aspect is they need to establish some sort of general framework for the relationship. Now here China's ahead of us. They want this new type of great power relationship. They want to avoid the Thucydides trap. President Xi is quite prepared to say that the cooperative aspects of our bilateral relationship are greater than the areas of disagreement between us. No one on the U.S. side seems prepared to say we don't want conflict with China. The closest we got was Secretary Tillerson going, but he used Chinese language. Now, I recall that Secretary Clinton used to talk about trying to get a stable balance between cooperation and competition in the relationship, with the cooperative aspects being more dominant. Now, that's an American way of saying it, which is different from saying no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, win-win cooperation. But the point is China has a strategy, And we seem reluctant to define a strategy of not getting into war with China. And that's an important factor. So it seems to me if we could get the two presidents confident they can work with each other, and if we could get a general framework that we need to address the trade issues. For example, China has been sending multiple signals. Nick, you can comment on this, that on the trade issues they're prepared to address our concerns about the trade imbalance. There'll be a give and take on that. So these are important concepts, and it seems to me we haven't gotten into this particular area as much as we should.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we have one down here, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Brandon Batch. I work for Chairman Michael McCall. I think I'm the only congressional staffer here, so I want to get your take on what you think Congress's role is during this time. I know there's been a few, particularly as it relates to the South China Sea issue. I know at the end of last year, I believe it was Senator Marco Rubio had legislation that would impose new economic sanctions on China for a lot of the activities that are currently taking place in the South China Sea. But what do you see as other options? Do you think sanctions or providing the president with additional leverage when negotiating with the Chinese is something that can be done through sanctions? Or in general, broadly speaking, what do you think are some other options that Congress has? Thank you.
30 seconds or less. We have, seriously, those are very big questions, the two questions that we just got, and I'm reluctant to press our panel to give short answers, but we have to give short answers because we have 4 more people who'd like to ask questions or make comments.
I'll make a couple brief comments. Stape, I agree, absolutely understaffed, and that's what I said at the outset. That's why we're not going to have any significant discussion of trade and economic issues beyond a few generalities, because we don't have a trade policy. We don't have a East Asia policy. We don't have anything that could be the basis for a more sustained, nuanced discussion. On whether or not the Chinese are prepared to give us more on trade, I don't know. They're certainly, they've indicated in some ways they're prepared to do more, but I think the steps that they've revealed so far are quite small. And as I said, I think the likelihood is our deficit with China is going to continue to go up. The only realistic way of dealing with it is to increase the savings rate in the United States so that our global deficit is smaller. We can't keep pointing fingers at the surplus countries.
South Korean election.
It's ironic, sadly, that just as we get things rolling with South Korea, we finally got a general security of military information agreement ready to be signed between the ROK and Japan, who've had their own political issues, as you all know. And then President Park Geun-hye gets into trouble. We finally get THAAD into South Korea, and now that's in jeopardy. So, yes, sir, it's going to be a rough ride here to see where we go on this, but we got to conform to this. Rolling 2 questions together, Ambassador Roy's very cogent comments about a strategy and your question about what can Congress do. Strategy is ultimately a balancing of ends. What we're trying to do means where the resources are and ways, how we're going to do it. And tax reform and everything is a big deal right now. Ultimately, in the American system, you got to get the American people's confidence so they'll part with tax money so that we can get the resources to do the kind of things that the government wants to do. All this stuff that we learned in Civics 101 at some point, but I would submit that we have been very bereft of any strategy worthy of the name for quite some time. And the 2 years I was in the Pentagon, I put my name to a whole bunch of strategy documents. They weren't really strategy documents. They were lists of unobjectionable aspirations. There was no there was no how we're going to do it. There was no parsing of resources and things. Now that we're faced with a real threat getting more dangerous from North Korea, and we have a position where our one of our biggest economic partners, if not the biggest in some terms, is also a major security concern. We really need to think through this, and it would really help if Congress would insist that the administration start talking in strategic terms to the Congress of the American people, so the American Congress, the U.S. Congress, can talk to their constituents about what it is we're trying to do and argue it out. Senator Cotton did a town hall meeting that went viral on YouTube because it was 2 hours of him being yelled at. The good news is he stood his ground and won the audience over after 2 hours. This is hard work, I get it. Senator McCain passed an initiative where we're providing funds to Southeast Asia to enhance their surveillance of the South China Sea. Those types of things are helpful, but we have to start tying this together. And going into the Mar-a-Lago meeting tomorrow, it's a little bit late to start developing the strategy right now, but we need to get on with this so that we know what we're trying to do, and we get away from handling everything an event at a time.
Harry.
I'll be very quick, just to take the point on strategy and the other on Congress. First on strategy, I think it's very clear. Donald Trump talked a lot about making, America first. On foreign policy, I think it's very simple what we need to do. We need to make Asia first. When you look at all the different problems that are in the Asia-Pacific and the broader Indo-Pacific, I think you have to do that. If you look at the trade relationship with China, if you look at all these problems, Asia's begging to be the focus for at least the next 10 to 20 years. I think the strategy, you could do a whole panel on it, but just very quickly, I think you need to repair the damage that was done by getting rid of TPP. It's going to be hard, but I think you need to have bilateral trade agreements with Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, or anybody else to try and reinforce and make sure that our allies and friends know that we're going to be there through the test of time and through any of these problems. So that would be sort of my quick strategy piece. As for Congress, I think the most important role that Congress can have is basically to keep pushing this administration to continue to make Asia the #1 focus. I think the big problem with the Obama administration is they declared this pivot or rebalance to the Asia Pacific. It was a great sound point, but it was underfunded, under-resourced, and anytime another major hotspot broke out, it seems like the pivot was sort of just left sitting there. So I think if Congress can just keep reinforcing how important Asia is and continue to press the point, I think we'd be well served.
Thank you very much, Harry. All right, I'd like to take actually the last 4 questions together and then give each of you on the panel one final opportunity to speak so that we're sure that we get everybody in.
I'll stick to a yes or no answer.
I have Yancey Molnar and Chris Nelson, and then we have you two gentlemen down at the end.
Real quick question for Nick. So given the reality that you stated about a likely increase in the trade deficit, given dollar appreciation over the coming years, how do we square that with the Commerce Department policy chief just stating that we're going to eliminate the trade deficit in 2 years? How would you do that? Are we missing something that this administration is going to do at a very broad level?
Okay, Chris Nelson.
It's hard to top that. Thanks. Just quickly on Stape's point, the only Asia person that we know is Matt Pottinger in the White House. Now, Matt knows this stuff, partly because he's an ex-scribbler, right? Reuters and Wall Street Journal. But Matt is very knowledgeable, but he's about it. In the gossip department, I keep hearing that Randy Shriver is going to get something good at defense. The last rumor I heard was policy. He's going to get policy, which would be good. But then what? We ain't got no names. So, and we're not going to get them in time to do any of this thinking that we're talking about. So that's my gossip. My question, a small two-parter. The Chinese have been using rather unsubtle economic leverage on our Korean friends. So I'm glad we've had this discussion about the coming transformation in Korea. But relating to that, have the Chinese learned any lessons from the effectiveness of that? Are they likely to try to employ that, especially with our friends on Taiwan? And that's the core of my question. What do the Chinese need to hear from Tsai Ing-wen that they are not hearing? What does Trump need to say or do, either in private or in public, that would be helpful to Taiwan and not make things more dangerous? And is it dangerous for Trump to say anything in public about Taiwan? I know our Taiwan friends have been very worried about this. I've been asked repeatedly, is there going to be a press conference? Oh my God, Are the Chinese going to keep using economic tools to get what they want? What do they really want on Taiwan? How do we work to try to mitigate the risks of that? Thanks.
Sir, down here at the end.
Hi. Brian Renbaum, Alt Media News. The answer to this question has basically been suggested. Sorry. The answer to the question I'm about to ask has basically been suggested, but I just want to ask it straight out. Basically, given that China has the power to shut off the lights in North Korea, should the primary focus of tomorrow's summit indefinitely be the imposition of that leverage to try to bring some amicable result to the nuclear question?
Okay. And last question over here.
Thank you, Boris Ruger, Deputy Chief of Mission at the German Embassy. By way of a comment, we had our Chancellor in town a few weeks ago, and I think the most important thing we tried to achieve was to establish a personal relationship with the President and get them talking. And I think that's certainly what we achieved. But as for the meeting that is coming up now, it seems to me that the issue of North Korea is the most pressing short-term issue on the agenda. But on the other hand, the President and this administration have made trade a key issue. So what can they do given the pressing need to engage China on North Korea? What can realistically be done on trade?
Okay. All right. So we have got 6 minutes until 10 o'clock. There are 3 of you. That's 2 minutes each. Nick.
The only way to eliminate our big global trade deficit in the short run is a massive depression in the United States.
That's true.
That would reduce investment, and we wouldn't have a trade deficit. Short of that, I don't think there's any solution on the horizon. In response to Chris's question about what Trump should say about Taiwan, nothing is my answer.
Korea, Chinese lessons from the economic sanctions that they're doing now. I think they've drawn lessons from the economic activities they've taken before. The embargo of rare earth metals, it's an autocratic government. They feel perfectly free to employ economic measures to achieve foreign policy gains. Taiwan agreed that saying nothing at this point should be the guidance. Should the focus be on China squeezing North Korea? Maybe, but I think we're putting way too much faith in thinking that China's got absolute control over North Korea. North Korea is a regime that cares nothing about the population of North Korea. They're going to be able to hang on through their international crime network regardless.
Let me just take quickly the question on North Korea and China. I think that's probably the most important. Look, I was struck actually, just very quickly, I went to a Track 2 dialogue back in 2013 in the Philippines, and I got to become very good friends with a senior PLA official, and we started talking about North Korea when it wasn't in so much of a time of crisis, and he said to me, look, Harry, we're not going to do anything on North Korea. Our biggest fear is a North Korean regime collapse and what that would entail. And his fears were pretty well documented, and this has been in the press. They do not want to see millions of impoverished North Koreans coming across the Yalu and creating a crisis. The Chinese are not going to spark that. What they're even more afraid of, and what I think the whole international community is afraid of, is if the regime did collapse in Pyongyang, you're going to have issues with loose WMD, who controls North Korea's not only nuclear weapons, but their robust chemical and biological weapons, and all those missiles, and all their artillery that's pointed at Seoul. What do you do with all that if the regime collapsed? So I don't think the Chinese are going to do, quite frankly, anything or very little on North Korea. What I think you can expect the Trump administration to say, at least in private to Xi Jinping, is allow us to put these secondary sanctions on. We'll keep you in the loop, or maybe not, or at least give you a tiny heads up. But I think that's really the best that you could hope for, to try and constrain the capability of their nuclear and missile programs to grow. I think that's really the best you're going to get.
I don't think we quite got the last question from our German colleague, Mr. Ruge, about this balance between North Korea and trade in talking to the Chinese. Is that how does the administration resolve that tension? Does anybody have a thought on that?
Well, I think this is where we need to learn to have two conversations with China going on at the same time. We can encourage all sorts of trade things as long as it's fair trade, and you know all the caveats we're putting on these things now. But we also need to have the hard conversation at the same time. Personal opinion, I think in the past we have held our fire on the hard issues in favor of, quote, maintaining the relationship with China, unquote, which is why I started off with the illustration from Carolyn Hack's. First order of business is we got to decide what kind of relationship we want.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this morning. Please thank our excellent panelists. Thank you.